It's Gradius III on Super NES Works Episode 5. We went a little out of sequence here. Gradius III actually arrived in Japan a few months before SimCity, but I wanted to cluster all of Nintendo's own US launch releases together. After 4 games that deftly show off the potential of the Super NES, Konami's debut on the platform serves as a sort of counterpoint. Not every Super NES game would be a towering technical achievement, and the Super NES had some hardware quirks that gave other developers a lot of trouble in the early going. After the initial rush to launch, third parties would smooth over a lot of their first-generation software issues, but here at the beginning of the console's life, things were sometimes a little rough. Gradius III makes for a concise showcase of the console's shortcomings. It's a great-looking and sounding adaptation of a stunning arcade game, but Konami had to make a lot of compromises in bringing it home. The original Gradius, as recently seen on NES Works, played practically the opposite role on NES as it does here. There, after a string of mostly middling to awful third-party releases, the first Gradius came along to demonstrate that the console could in fact play home to wholly satisfying arcade conversions. Sure, Gradius didn't look quite as good as its coin-op source material, it trimmed the player's arsenal potential by 2/5, and it had to drop the vertical scrolling from several stages. But aside from some slowdown in the tentacle brain zone toward the end of the game, Konami managed to bring a cutting-edge shooter cabinet to far less powerful home hardware with both style and technical prowess. Gradius III, by contrast, looks every bit as good as its arcade counterpart, and it also manages to retain the vertical scrolling and the third and fourth option power-up that its NES predecessor had been forced to drop. Sound-wise, the Super NES version is arguably better than the arcade game, reworking the sometimes strident FM synthesis of the upright with the console's warm samples, and it offers a huge amount of weapon customization in addition to the coin-op's loadout presets. However, no one with any respect for the English language would describe this game as possessing technical prowess. For starters, it's missing several stages, and the ones that do appear frequently suffer from the removal of trademark elements. Minor enemies like the leaping sand lions of Stage 1 are gone, along with the spiders that weave their way onto the screen during the first boss encounter, which become weird little blobs here that don't leave web strands behind. The obligatory Moai stage no longer begins with enormous stone heads flying onto the screen, depositing smaller versions of themselves on the nearby asteroids, and the Fire Zone boss battle skips the 3-headed dragon entirely. These cuts don't feel quite so severe as the entirely missing stages in the home port. The impressive-looking Crystal Zone that appears toward the end of Gradius III in arcades failed to make its way onto Super NES. And so too did the strange 3D bonus zone that shows up after level 3 of the coin-op version. The 3D stage's absence didn't really hurt the game. That one arcade level represents the Gradius series' sole foray into 3D visuals outside the entirely first-person spin-off Solar Assault, and it feels pretty slight. Still, this is something of a missed opportunity. One of the Super NES's big selling points at launch was its ability to fake 3D with its graphical Mode 7. And it might have been nice for Konami to have attempted to use the hardware's capacity to wrangle something worth playing out of the arcade's little dalliance in 3D. In fairness, Gradius III doesn't appear to have been an attempt by Konami to create a direct, faithful arcade conversion. The Super NES game is an adapted work, not a direct port, and it features many changes besides mere excisions. It's fair to say that while some alterations likely happened as a result of cartridge space limitations or the fear of melting down the Super NES's processor, many other changes between the two versions of Gradius III resulted from an innate desire to improve the game. Many stages or stage elements shift their order within the flow of the game without materially changing, and some revisions actually involved expanding existing content and adding new material. The brief Speed Zone maze that appeared in the arcade version following the final boss now appears about 2/3 of the way through the game, and it's greatly expanded in length. Similarly, the Rocky Zone that players have to drill through with their weapons, and the similarly conceived Life Force-like Biomutation Zone jump around in sequence as well. And while Gradius III loses some arcade bosses, it gains entirely new bosses. In short, it feels like Konami treated Super NES Gradius III as a sort of second draft, refining some of the things that didn't work in the game's initial release. One of those things that didn't work was definitely the difficulty level. Gradius III in arcades has a reputation for being insanely difficult, And the more you power up your Vic Viper fighter, the faster and more aggressive enemies and their projectiles become. The Super NES game retains the vast majority of the arcade's enemies, their placement, and their attacks, but it smooths things over to make the prospect of finishing the home version somewhat reasonable. For starters, it allows players 2 continues versus the coin-op's 0. A massive improvement in and of itself, especially considering the cruel disempowerment that goes hand in hand with Death and Gradius games. You can also choose from 3 difficulty levels ranging from the tough but fair easy to a kick you in the groin hard setting. There's also an unlockable arcade difficulty mode that requires superhuman reflexes both to unlock and to play. But even arcade mode on Super NES is technically less challenging than actually playing the coin-op, and therein lies the most complicated facet of this port. The Super NES version of Gradius III suffers a massive technical shortcoming in the form of constant, high-impact slowdown almost from the very first screen. Despite its general excellence, the NES version of Gradius wasn't entirely free of slowdown. The tentacle golem zone that followed the Moai gauntlet taxed the poor 6502 processor to the breaking point, and as soon as those brain blobs began firing projectiles while waving their appendages around, the NES just slowed to a crawl. Well, Gradius 3 plays like that basically from the moment the very first enemy fires a bullet. The game appears to have been optimized around the Vic Viper's movements and attacks, and even a fully loaded ship with 4 options, a shield, missiles, can zip around firing without really having an impact on the game's performance. But with the appearance of more than a couple of enemy ships, the action begins to drag. When the bad guys begin firing off their tiny diamond-shaped bullets, things bog down even more. And oh my god, just you wait until you get to the bubble zone, where massive transparent blobs of gelatin break into ever smaller balls of goop that fill the screen as you fire on them. Gradius 3 runs at about half speed in any scene that involves even a moderate amount of return fire, and this is a game with a lot of return fire. Even the arcade version suffered from a fair amount of slowdown. The PlayStation compilation of Gradius 3 and 4 featured an option to effectively overclock the game and prevent slowdown should you wish it. One of the reasons Gradius 3 has its reputation for being so incredibly challenging has to do with the fact that Konami upped the ante over its predecessors by incorporating a degree of enemy projectiles that wouldn't really become common in shooters until the Danmaku format appeared several years later. And what you see here aren't pattern-based bullet curtains, but rather hatefully targeted bullets that home in on the player's position. Konami literally made the game more challenging than the arcade board could handle. And the Super NES processor has an even more difficult time handling all the moving objects at play. Nintendo had hyped their 16-bit console as some sort of supercomputer, and it could indeed perform some impressive graphical tricks. Gradius 3, however, revealed that the Super NES was anything but all-powerful. Considering the console's 16-bit processor ran at about 1/6 the speed of Gradius 3's 32-bit arcade board, it's actually pretty amazing that Konami managed to even turn in an adaptation this good. But even so, it was hard not to compare Gradius 3 and other Super NES shooters from the early days to comparable games appearing on TurboGrafx-16 and Genesis, and find Nintendo's system a bit lacking on the blistering action front. By the end of 1991, the Super NES library would boast some incredible simulations, RPGs, sports titles, genre-busting hybrid works, and some great platformers. On the shooter front, though, the console felt decidedly lacking. That shortcoming didn't escape the notice of magazine critics of the day, who were quick to criticize technical shortcomings, especially as regarded the hardcore genres they prided themselves on being masters of, like, shooters. So with Gradius 3's arrival, the honeymoon came to an end, and the stunning Super NES debut lineup revealed the first chinks in Nintendo's 16-bit armor. And yet, as much as the diehard fans criticize the glacial sluggishness of this port, in a way it's maybe not completely bad. Gradius 3's tendency to slow to a crawl as soon as enemies train their guns on the Vic Viper certainly doesn't impress from a hardware showcase perspective, and the erratic shifts in the speed can be disorienting at times. Yet the flip side of that half-speed sensation is that the game becomes much, much easier. The Super NES port makes a lot of minor tweaks to give players an easier time, beginning with the addition of those limited continues and showing up throughout the game in other ways. You can set the Viper's missiles and cannons to operate with the same button. They were independently controlled in the arcade. And you can turn on auto-fire. You can use an auto power-up scheme to optimize your ship loadout if you're not confident in your mastery of the power-up system. Minor details within the stage layouts work to your favor too, like the newfound ability to destroy certain inanimate obstacles that were indestructible before. It's still nothing quite compares to the impact that the game's massive slowdown has on your reaction time. When you're skidding through a field of tiny bullets or moai rings with only a Viper-sized opening to maneuver within, the fact that those bullets are streaking through space at half speed is an absolute godsend. Sure, the Viper also moves at half speed, but you have more time to see what's coming your way, and to move the ship to safety. Playing Gradius III on Super NES helps you better understand how those slow-mo showcase scenes in the X-Men movies must have felt for Quicksilver. I don't think it's a coincidence that the single most difficult part of Gradius III on Super NES is the high-speed corridor gauntlet. Only a handful of enemy cannons show up during that zone, and they're barely on-screen long enough to fire off any projectiles. Which means that one sequence alone runs at the intended speed, meaning it's the one portion of the game that demands quick reactions. That makes Gradius III a real toss-up. Yeah, it strains at the hardware and chugs in a way that feels just as embarrassing now as it did back in the day. But on the other hand, you're a lot more likely to see the end of this version of the game than you would if Konami had managed to somehow squeeze better performance out of the Super NES. And there honestly is plenty to like about this game on its own merits. It feels like a supersized version of the original Gradius, and its sequel, Vulcan Venture, which sadly never made it to the US until many years later. Instead, we got Life Force on NES, which also contributed a reasonable share of ideas to Gradius III as well. Aside from the in-depth loadout customization, Gradius III does feel somewhat short on new ideas, but there's a lot of creativity within its treatment of old ideas. So while Gradius III doesn't really show the Super NES in the most flattering light, it's still a solid addition to the console library. There's enough quality here that many fans think on it kindly, regardless of the places where it stumbles. Perhaps not as impressive a debut as Konami made on the NES, but that's okay. They'll make up for it before too long. Next time, Capcom also trips over its own feet with its arrival on Super NES.